Stephen Miller believed he could shut down Jasmine Crockett with constant interruptions and intimidation tricks. He cut her off 6 straight times, raising his voice each time, growing harsher and more forceful as he tried to silence her. The hearing room went still, the tension buzzing in the air like charged wires before a thunderstorm. But what Congresswoman Crockett finally said on her 7th attempt didn't just quiet Miller. It completely shattered his argument and left him speechless, something that had never happened in his political career. What came next would take over the internet, generate millions of views across social media, and prove a simple truth. The strongest way to stop a bully isn't by copying their behavior. It's by striking with accuracy, honesty, and perfect timing, landing a blow no one expects. Before we dive into this remarkable face-off, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these intense, political moments. Trust me, you'll want to see what's coming. Now let's step into the showdown that has everyone talking. That Tuesday morning, the hearing chamber was packed. Cameras pointed toward the witness table as the Immigration Policy Committee prepared for what many assumed would be a routine session. But this day would be anything but ordinary. Stephen Miller, former White House advisor and now a policy consultant, sat at the table with his usual air of certainty. His suit was perfectly pressed. His expression carried the trademark smirk he had worn through countless political fights, and his presence signaled confidence. The atmosphere buzzed. Reporters crowded the press section, laptops open, fingers ready to strike the keys the instant something happened. Spectators filled the walls, some in MAGA hats, others pinned with Democratic badges. The low hum of the air conditioning couldn't mask the sharp tension hanging over the room. Miller's legal team sat just behind him, their briefcases neatly arranged, every document and statistic at hand. They had drilled him endlessly, rehearsing responses, preparing deflections, and stocking him with lines designed to counter every angle. To them, Miller wasn't just a witness. He was their weapon, someone who could face down any attack and turn it back on the questioner. They had seen him do it time after time. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone and reviewed her notes for the final time. The Democrat from Texas had prepared carefully, aware of Miller's history of aggressive tactics and verbal sparring. She had studied his style, analyzed hours of his testimony, and mapped out strategies with her staff. They had pulled reports, cross-checked documents, and built responses for every possible turn. Yet Crockett's real preparation had not come from papers or reports. It came from 15 years in courtrooms where she had faced hostile witnesses and combative attorneys trying every trick to silence her. What she wasn't fully prepared for, however, was just how relentless Miller would be in trying to cut her off. To grasp what was about to explode in that room, you need to understand who these two figures are and why this clash mattered. Stephen Miller had built his entire career on being the fighter who never retreated. At 38, he was already a recognizable face in immigration policy, famous for his hardline views and his ability to dominate any stage he stood on. Supporters hailed him as a sharp strategist defending American workers. His critics called him far worse. But no matter the perspective, everyone agreed. Miller was a master at controlling conversations and rarely lost in verbal combat. His hearing playbook was simple: defend the former administration's immigration policies and dismiss every criticism as partisan theater. He had used the same formula countless times before: interrupt, redirect, and overwhelm. By cutting questioners off, flooding the room with rapid answers, and forcing opponents to chase after him, Miller had built a reputation as someone who could always turn the tables. His supporters didn't see the interruptions as rudeness. They saw them as battle tactics. The only way to fight what they believed was biased questioning. Facing him was Jasmine Crockett, a 43-year-old freshman congresswoman who had quickly proven herself to be one of the sharpest questioners in the House. A former civil rights lawyer from Dallas, she had long experience handling hostile opposition and dealing with intimidation in the courtroom. This wasn't new ground for her, but this confrontation went beyond immigration policy. It was about representation. Crockett embodied a rising generation of Democratic leadership, young, diverse and fearless in holding power accountable. Her community had elected her to Congress to ask the questions others avoided, and to stand firm no matter who sat across from her. Miller, meanwhile, embodied the old-school politics of aggression. He built his brand on dominating through volume, controlling narratives, and never letting an opponent finish a thought. Over the years, he had sharpened his style in interviews, testimonies, and debates, knowing that in the social media era, controlling the room mattered more than giving real answers. His method was to overwhelm with statistics, blame past administrations, and frame critics as either uninformed or biased. This approach kept his supporters energized, convinced their champion was always on the attack, always winning. The stakes at this particular hearing were massive. Recent immigration policies had drawn nationwide protests, especially regarding family separations and detention conditions. Crockett had just 15 minutes to question Miller, and she intended to use every second. Miller, however, had been fully briefed on her background, her style, and her likely angles. His team's plan was blunt. Don't let her build momentum, cut her off, and keep control. What Miller didn't anticipate was that Crockett had studied him just as thoroughly. She knew his tactics, his interruptions, his patterns, and she had a strategy ready to flip them against him. The chairman gavelled the session into order. Cameras zoomed in on both figures, capturing what would soon become one of the most viral exchanges in modern politics. Miller straightened his tie, leaned forward, and prepared to unleash the tactics that had defined his career. Crockett took a steady breath, fixed her eyes on him, and prepared to show what happens when preparation meets persistence. She began with what seemed like a simple question, a request for the timeline of a policy's implementation. But Miller immediately recognized the setup and cut in. Mr. Miller, regarding the family separation protocols introduced in 2018, could you explain the timeline for when families were supposed to be? Congresswoman, Miller snapped, his voice slicing through hers. You are fundamentally misinterpreting the legal framework here. What you're describing as family separation was, in reality, a law enforcement measure against unlawful border entries. And if you had gone through the actual statute, you'd see that his interruption was sharp and deliberate, aimed at throwing her off balance from the very first inquiry. Miller's media training had ingrained in him that the opening seconds of any hostile exchange were vital. Establish dominance immediately, control the conversation from the outset, and never allow the opponent to build rhythm. Crockett paused, her pen suspended over her notes. The interruption was precisely what she had expected, yet she stayed composed. Mr. Miller, I value your perspective, but I'd like to finish my question first. She attempted again. As I was saying, regarding the timeline for family reunification— No, Miller interjected, dismissively waving his hand. You can't just toss around charged words like family separation without context. The media has completely twisted what truly happened, and frankly, questions like yours are exactly why the American people don't trust Congress to engage in serious policy debates. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Miller's supporters in the audience nodded in agreement while Crockett's backers looked increasingly frustrated. Yet Crockett herself stayed perfectly calm, jotting notes on her pad. Committee members shifted uneasily in their seats. Miller's habit of cutting in wasn't unusual, but the aggressive tone this early on was raising eyebrows, even among his allies. Crockett lifted her eyes from her notes, her voice steady. Mr. Miller, I recognize you have strong views on this subject, but my time for questions is limited, and I'd appreciate the chance to ask them. She began her third attempt. According to documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests, your office sent a memo on June 15, 2018, specifically stating, "Oh, here we go with the leaked papers," Miller broke in, his voice dripping with disdain. Congresswoman, if you're going to rely on cherry-picked memos taken out of context by partisan activists, then this isn't a real discussion. This is political theater. He leaned back in his chair with that trademark smirk, clearly enjoying the disruption. His posture radiated control, arms stretched across the chair's back, chin slightly lifted, eyes scanning the audience as though he were giving a speech rather than answering questions. This was Miller at his best, playing the role that had earned him recognition. Maybe instead of reading opposition research, you could ask about the actual results of our policies, such as the sharp decline in illegal crossings or the dismantling of trafficking networks. The dismissive flick of his hand as he spoke was another calculated move to make Crockett's questions appear petty and unworthy of real answers. Miller had honed this mixture of verbal force and physical disregard through years of confrontational interviews. Crockett's jaw tightened just slightly, though her voice remained even. A few committee members now appeared irritated by Miller's behavior, yet none stepped in to reestablish order. "Mr. Miller," Crockett said, "I'm asking about specific policy implementations grounded in official government records. Are you suggesting these documents are fake?" She pressed on. "The memo I'm citing states that separation would take place regardless of age, even including infants and toddlers. Can you explain how this policy benefited?" "Stop right there," Miller snapped, jabbing a finger in her direction. "You're doing exactly what I expected, cherry-picking a single line from a complex document and twisting it for political points. This is why real policy experts can't have meaningful discussions with politicians more focused on sound bites than solutions." His voice rose sharper and more forceful. "You want to talk about children? Fine. Let's talk about the children trafficked by cartels across our border. Let's talk about kids used as human shields by adults who weren't even their parents. But you don't want to talk about that, do you? Because it doesn't fit your story." The room now hummed with tension. Some attendees scribbled notes furiously, while others pulled out phones to record. Social media was already buzzing with clips of the fiery back and forth. Crockett still looked calm, though there was a new steadiness in her posture, a slight straightening that hinted she was preparing for something. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I notice you haven't actually answered any of my questions about specific policies. Are you unable to defend them, or are you simply refusing to?" Miller's eyes flared with anger. "I'm refusing to engage with gotcha questions designed to generate viral clips instead of genuine oversight. If you want a real discussion on immigration policy, I'm here for it. If you want a grandstand for Twitter, find someone else." Crockett nodded slowly, flipping through her papers. When she raised her eyes, there was a quiet confidence in her look, something Miller didn't recognize, something that should have warned him to be more cautious. "Let me try a different angle," she said. "Mr. Miller, you've been involved in immigration policy for over a decade. In your professional judgment—" "Oh, please," Miller scoffed with a laugh. "Don't act like this is about my professional judgment. This is about you fishing for a sound bite to look tough on cable news tonight. I've seen this routine 100 times, Congresswoman. Freshman members show up thinking they'll make a name for themselves by attacking seasoned professionals who actually know these issues." He gestured broadly to the room. "You've been in Congress, what, 2 years? And you believe you grasp immigration policy better than someone who's worked on it long before you ever ran for office? This is exactly the problem with our political system. Inexperienced politicians showboating instead of learning." By now, the room had fallen nearly silent. Even Miller's allies appeared uneasy at the personal edge of his attack. Members of the committee traded looks, and the atmosphere was so tense it felt like it could be sliced open. Crockett placed her pen on the desk and fixed her eyes on Miller. For the first time since questioning had begun, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but the kind of smile courtroom rivals had long learned to dread. "Mr. Miller," she said softly, "I appreciate that comment. Now, I have something to ask you." Miller leaned forward, clearly preparing to interrupt again, but something in her tone stopped him cold. The entire room held still. Crockett's voice was steady, deliberate, and razor-sharp. "Mr. Miller, if you truly consider yourself an experienced authority on immigration policy, can you explain why the family reunification database you oversaw had no mechanism to track which children were connected to which parents?" The question lingered in the chamber like a bomb about to detonate. Miller opened his mouth, ready to cut her off again, but Crockett pressed forward. Her words gained strength and certainty. "Because according to the Inspector General's own report, not leaked files, not opposition talking points, but your government's official findings, Your policy tore 2,816 children away from their families with no reliable process to bring them back. You literally took infants from their parents and failed to record where they were placed. Miller's complexion drained. His smirk vanished entirely. And when your own staff asked you about this, Crockett continued, your response, and I'm quoting directly from the Inspector General's report, was, "That's not my problem. That's for the downstream agencies to figure out." The room fell utterly silent. Only the hum of the air system could be heard. So here's my question, Mr. Miller, and I'd ask you to answer without cutting me off this time. How does a man who claims expertise in immigration policy design a system that separates families yet creates no plan to reunite them? Because to me, that doesn't look like expertise. That looks like either incompetence or cruelty, and I'm trying to figure out which one applies to you. Miller sat motionless, his lips parted slightly. For the first time in his public life, he had no reply. The man who had built his persona on always having words was suddenly mute. The silence stretched like hours, though it was only about 10 seconds. Then someone in the audience gasped. A committee member leaned forward, cameras zoomed in tight on Miller's stunned expression. But Crockett wasn't done. "While you're working on that answer," she pressed, "let me pose another question. During your tenure, 545 children were never reunited with their families. 545, Mr. Miller. Some of them were newborns, babies too young to say their own names, let alone their parents' names." Her tone rose with passion, yet stayed firmly in control. "You want to talk about knowledge? You want to talk about credentials? I've practiced as a civil rights lawyer for 15 years. I've represented families broken apart by bureaucracies that didn't care about their humanity. And what I see here is not expertise. It's a man who treated human lives like paperwork and grew angry when asked to justify it." Miller finally managed to speak, but his voice was barely audible. "Congresswoman, that's not... The processes were what, Mr. Miller?" Crockett snapped. "Were they designed to inflict maximum harm on families? Because that's exactly what they achieved." Crockett leaned closer, eyes locked on his. "You've interrupted me 6 times in just the last 10 minutes, all because you didn't want the American people to hear these questions. You attacked my background, my experience, and my motives because you thought you could pressure me into silence." She paused, letting the weight of her words land. "But here's what you miscalculated. I've spent years in courtrooms facing men who thought they could frighten me into backing down. I've stood up against prosecutors trying to bulldoze my clients, judges who ignored my arguments, and opposing counsel who assumed a young black woman couldn't possibly know what she was saying." Miller was visibly trembling now, gripping the table with white knuckles. His face flushed, turning from its usual self-assurance to a deep red crawling up his neck and into his hairline. The change was so stark that camera crews instinctively zoomed in to capture every detail of his distress. "So your constant interruptions don't rattle me, Mr. Miller. Your patronizing tone doesn't scare me, and your evasions don't surprise me. What does surprise me is that you ever thought these tactics would succeed." Her words floated above him like a blade poised to fall on his reputation. The confidence that had carried him through countless hostile interviews had deserted him. The man who prided himself on never showing weakness was displaying it live for millions to see. Crockett leaned back, her voice once again calm and professional. The stark contrast between her composure and Miller's unraveling state was unmistakable, and every camera captured it in full detail. "Now, Mr. Miller, would you like to answer my original question about the family reunification database? Or would you prefer to explain to the American public why you believe the children you separated don't deserve an answer at all?" The silence that followed was crushing. Even the air system seemed to have stopped. Committee members leaned closer in their seats. The audience held its breath, and journalists hurriedly jotted down every detail of what they were seeing. Miller fixed his eyes on her for several seconds. His whole demeanor shifted. The aggressive stance disappeared. The smug grin was gone. The confident interruption stopped altogether. The processes we followed were within all applicable statutes," he muttered nervously. "That's not what I asked," Crockett replied calmly. "I asked about the database. Did you create a system to track separated families, yes or no?" Another silence followed. Miller glanced around the chamber as if expecting help that would never arrive. The system was handled by different agencies. So that's a no, Crockett concluded. You separated nearly 3,000 families without establishing a way to reunite them. Thank you for that confirmation. Even before the session was over, clips of the confrontation were spreading everywhere. Someone in the audience had live-streamed the entire exchange, and the hashtag #Miller silenced began trending almost instantly. The exact moment when Miller's voice cracked as he attempted to defend the family separation policy was being circulated, thousands of times each minute. But the clip that really exploded online was Crockett's statement about being a civil rights lawyer who had faced intimidation for her entire career. Her line, "I've faced men who thought they could scare me into silence," instantly became a meme. Thousands of people began posting their own stories of resisting bullies both at work and in their personal lives. Miller's desperate attempts to regain control only deepened the damage. Every shaky reply was recorded, cut, and reshared as proof of what happens when someone finally challenges intimidation tactics that had long gone unchecked. Other committee members quickly jumped in with additional questions, sensing his vulnerability like never before. Questions he might once have swatted away with interruptions and pivots now received halting, uncertain replies. One Republican ally tried to rescue him with an easy question about border enforcement numbers, but even that failed. Miller stumbled, rambled, and gave an unfocused answer that only revealed how shaken he was. The chairman soon called a short recess, officially to let staff adjust equipment, but everyone knew it was really to give Miller time to recover. During the break, reporters were furiously typing on their phones, updating editors about the dramatic clash they had just witnessed. Political commentators were already drafting instant analyses about the significance of seeing Miller, long feared as one of Washington's toughest fighters, reduced to stammering evasions by a first-term Congresswoman. The most telling sign came from his own staff. Instead of the confident post-testimony strategy meetings they usually held, his aides huddled around him with worried faces, clearly scrambling for a way to salvage a collapse they hadn't anticipated. Within half an hour of adjournment, Miller silenced had become the #1 trending topic nationwide. And it wasn't just trending. It was dominating social media in a way political stories rarely do. The 6-minute video of Miller's repeated interruptions, followed by Crockett's devastating comeback, was being reposted thousands of times per minute. News outlets quickly abandoned other stories to dissect the viral showdown. But what truly struck a nerve wasn't only the policy argument. It was what Crockett's composure represented to countless people who had endured similar bullying in their own lives. Finally, someone who knows how to deal with a workplace bully read one viral tweet with 50,000 likes. "This is what it looks like when preparation meets opportunity," wrote another, sharing the clip widely. Interestingly, the most replayed clip wasn't even the family separation database exchange. It was Crockett's remark about men who thought they could silence her. That 15-second soundbite was shared by corporate executives, students confronting tough professors, and activists battling hostile opponents. Political analysts declared it one of the most significant committee moments in recent years, not for new policy revelations, but for the shift in power it illustrated. Miller had built his reputation on being unbeatable in verbal combat, the go-to figure for conservatives needing someone to dominate tough interviews or shut down questioning. His skill in controlling conversations through interruption and aggression had made him both admired by allies and dreaded by rivals. Consultants studied his methods and taught them to Republican candidates. The Miller method was used in workshops across conservative circles, but Crockett exposed the flaw in that playbook. It only works if the opponent doesn't know how to respond. Miller's tactics succeeded for years because most politicians aren't trained for courtroom-style intimidation, one former congressional aide observed. But Crockett spent 15 years in civil rights law handling exactly this kind of pressure. She knew how to let him unravel. Conservative pundits tried defending Miller by claiming Crockett had been unfair or asking gotcha questions. But their arguments only highlighted how completely the tables had turned. The very man who had long dismissed others for complaining about gotcha politics was now being shielded with the same excuse. Beyond the politics, the exchange reflected a broader shift, the changing face of authority in America. Miller embodied an old style of dominance: interrupt, overwhelm, never allow the other side to finish. It was the strategy of men who steamrolled boardrooms, courtrooms, and debates with sheer aggression. Crockett symbolized something else: patience, preparation, and confidence built from real-world struggles, not just political theater. "This wasn't just about immigration," wrote one columnist. "It was about what happens when someone who thrives on intimidation meets someone who cannot be intimidated." Observers also noted the generational angle. Miller, 38, wasn't old guard, but his tactics came from an older era of combat. Crockett, only 5 years older, represented a new breed of politicians hardened in community battles, civil rights fights, and struggles where lives were on the line, not just talking points. Miller's team scrambled into damage control mode, but their counterattacks only worsened the fallout. Their first move was to go after Crockett personally, questioning her credentials and accusing her of being unprofessional. Within hours, his communications director was on cable news trying desperately to reframe the story. Mr. Miller attempted to frame the exchange as a serious discussion about policy, while insisting that Congresswoman Crockett seemed far more focused on staging viral sound bites than on performing true oversight, he told a host. Yet that tactic blew up dramatically when clips of Miller constantly interrupting were played next to his public claims about professionalism. Online, users began splicing together montages showing Miller cutting Crockett off 6 separate times, while his allies preached about civility and respectful conversation. The visual contrast was brutal. Miller's own camp spoke of dignity while footage revealed him repeatedly talking over an elected member of Congress. The contradiction was so glaring that even right-leaning commentators started backing away from defending him. Their backup plan was to pivot the conversation back toward policy substance, issuing lengthy statements full of immigration numbers and border enforcement accomplishments. But those statements were mostly brushed aside because the narrative had already shifted to something larger than policy details. Miller, uncharacteristically, stayed mostly quiet for the first 2 days following the hearing, surprising given that he normally fired back within hours. When he finally broke his silence, it came through a carefully polished release that skipped over any mention of the clash itself, instead restating his broader stance on immigration. The showdown reverberated through Washington's political class. Democrats, who had once hesitated to push back against combative Republican witnesses, suddenly had a clear model for countering intimidation. Crockett showed that you don't out-yell bullies, one Democratic strategist explained. You outthink them and out-prepare them. On the Republican side, consultants quietly urged their clients to use aggressive tactics more selectively. The Miller playbook had not only collapsed, it had been turned against him. Reports said several upcoming hearings were reshaped as attorneys, and witnesses worked to avoid the same kind of hostile posture that once helped Miller, but had now burned him. Often lost in pundit commentary was the human weight behind Crockett's line of questioning. Her focus on the family reunification database wasn't mere theatrics. It was about real children still separated from parents years after initial enforcement. Advocacy groups seized the spotlight to renew calls for accountability and reform. Congresswoman Crockett did in one moment what we've been pushing to achieve for years, said one advocate. She forced someone in authority to face the human consequences of policy without dodging behind talking points. Families impacted by separations shared their own stories online, giving faces and voices to the statistics Crockett highlighted. Analysts soon labeled the confrontation the Crockett template, a new formula for handling aggressive witnesses and adversarial interviews. The elements of that template were clear: meticulous preparation with documented facts, patient restraint that allowed an opponent to overreach, and the ability to flip interruptions into proof of bad faith. Miller's fatal miscalculation was believing that talking over his opponent 6 times would project strength. Instead, it signaled fear of her questions, as one political scientist pointed out. Training groups quickly began adding the clash into programs for candidates and activists. This is mandatory viewing for anyone who might face hostile questioning, one trainer said. As the dust settled and longer reflections emerged, new questions surfaced about its broader meaning for political debate. Would other combative figures change course after witnessing Miller's implosion? Would witnesses think twice before relying on constant interruptions? Did the moment signify a deeper change in how political authority is contested? Or was it simply one case of a highly skilled lawmaker exploiting an arrogant rival's missteps? The true test, one columnist wrote, is whether others can reproduce this approach or if it was a one-time lightning strike unique to Crockett's preparation and instincts. But perhaps the most important outcome dealt with representation and voice in American democracy. For millions of viewers, seeing Crockett refuse to be drowned out was more than just political theater. It was proof that someone like them could stand toe-to-toe with a figure who once seemed untouchable. 6 months later, the confrontation still appeared in political debates and training sessions. Yet its reach extended well beyond Washington. Business schools analyzed it in courses on negotiation and conflict. Law schools worked it into trial, advocacy, and cross-examination classes. Leadership seminars used it as a case study in distinguishing aggression from real strength. It's a perfect example of how preparation and strategy can beat what looks like brute force, one business professor explained. The episode also became a cultural touchpoint in discussions of race, gender, and power. Crockett's composed dismantling of Miller's bullying struck a chord with people who had faced similar workplace or personal battles. She proved you don't need to match aggression with aggression, one commentator wrote. Sometimes calm confidence, backed with preparation, is the strongest answer. In the end, the exchange between Stephen Miller and Jasmine Crockett grew into far more than a viral clip. It became a lesson on confronting bullies, an illustration of planning defeating bluster, and clear evidence that interruptions can be turned into weapons against the interrupter. Miller tried to dominate with volume and intimidation, tactics that had long served him well. Years of practice had shaped him into one of Washington's most feared witnesses. Opponents often dreaded sharing a stage with him, yet Crockett flipped his methods on their head, exposing how his repeated cutoffs revealed the topics he was most desperate to avoid. Each interruption underscored that he had no answers. What was meant to silence her instead primed her devastating seventh statement, a calm, factual response that cut sharper than any shout. That single moment echoed with anyone who had ever been dismissed, interrupted, or belittled. It proved that sometimes the quietest voice carries the most force. That was the political battle everyone kept talking about. A textbook case of what happens when preparation collides with opportunity and when someone finally refuses to be silenced. If you liked this breakdown of one of the most dramatic political clashes in recent years, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss moments like this. What's your take on Crockett's strategy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to share this video with anyone who needs to see how political bullying finally met its match. We'll catch you in the next video, where we'll unpack the latest political drama making waves in Washington.